The worn handle of the coffee carafe left a familiar dent in my palm, a pressure point that had become almost comforting in its predictability over the past 18 months. I shifted my weight from one aching foot to the other, feeling the vinyl of my cheap work shoes creak with the movement, while refilling Mrs. Patterson's cup for the third time that morning at the Bluebird Cafe. The coffee itself tasted bitter on my tongue, a permanent metallic aftertaste that came from breathing in the steam hour after hour in this cramped, overheated space. The Bluebird had seen better days, probably sometime in the 1970s, judging by the faded turquoise vinyl booths and the chipped formica countertops. The whole place smelled perpetually of burnt coffee, grease from the ancient fryer, and that distinctive mustiness that clung to old buildings near the waterfront. Through the front windows, I could see the gray morning light struggling to penetrate the salt-crusted glass, casting everything inside in a dim, underwater quality. "More cream, hun?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her weathered hand already reaching for the small metal pitcher before I could respond. She'd been coming here every morning for longer than I'd been alive, according to Rita, my manager. Some people found comfort in routine. I understood that instinct, though my own routines felt less like comfort and more like survival. "Of course, Mrs. Patterson." I managed a smile as I retrieved a fresh pitcher from behind the counter, my reflection catching briefly in the cloudy mirror that hung above the coffee station. 22 years old, but the shadows under my eyes and the tightness around my mouth made me look older. My dark blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and my uniform, a pale blue dress that matched the cafe's name, hung loose on my frame. I'd lost weight over the past few months, stress eating away at me more efficiently than any diet. The morning rush, such as it was, had settled into the usual lull between breakfast and lunch. Just Mrs. Patterson, 2 construction workers nursing coffee at the counter, and old Mr. Chen reading his newspaper in the corner booth he'd claimed as his personal office. The soundtrack of the cafe never changed. The hiss and gurgle of the ancient coffee maker, the intermittent crackle of grease in the fryer, Rita's radio playing soft rock from the kitchen, and the rhythmic squeak of my shoes against the checkered linoleum as I made my rounds. My lower back had developed a persistent ache that never quite disappeared anymore, a dull throb that intensified whenever I bent or stretched. Standing all day was taking its toll, though I'd never admit it to Rita. I needed this job too badly to complain about anything as minor as physical discomfort. The Bluebird wasn't much, barely minimum wage, plus whatever tips the regulars felt generous enough to leave, but it was mine, and in this economy, that meant everything. "Tessa," Rita's voice cut through the ambient noise, sharp with urgency. "We've got a situation." I turned to find my manager emerging from the kitchen, her round face flushed, and her graying hair escaping from beneath her hairnet in wild wisps. Rita had run the Bluebird for 15 years, and in all the time I'd known her, I'd never seen her look quite this flustered. "The new owner is coming today," she announced, wringing her hands on her apron. "Today. Can you believe it? They just called to say he'll be here within the hour, and look at this place." She gestured helplessly at the dining room, as if seeing it for the first time through critical eyes. My stomach dropped. We'd all heard rumors about the cafe being sold last month, whispers about corporate chains swooping in to buy up the waterfront properties, transforming our modest neighborhood into something unrecognizable. But Rita had assured us it was just talk, that the Bluebird would always be the Bluebird. "I thought that deal fell through," I managed, gripping the coffee carafe tighter. "Apparently not." Rita's voice carried an edge of panic I'd never heard before. "Different buyer, some investor type." "Oh God, Tessa, what if he closes us down? What if he wants to gut the place and turn it into one of those artisanal coffee bars with $15 lattes?" The construction workers at the counter exchanged glances, their conversation dying mid-sentence. Even Mrs. Patterson looked up from her coffee, concern etching deeper lines into her already wrinkled face. The Bluebird wasn't just a cafe to the people who came here. It was a remnant of the neighborhood's former self, before the luxury condos and high-end boutiques started creeping in from downtown. "We need to make a good impression," Rita continued, already moving toward the supply closet. "Tessa, grab the good silverware from the back. I want table 4 set up perfectly. That's the one by the window with the best light. And for God's sake, try to do something about those coffee stains on the counter." For the next 45 minutes, we transformed the Bluebird with the desperate energy of people who knew their livelihoods hung in the balance. I scrubbed surfaces until my hands ached, polished the smudged windows until they actually transmitted sunlight, and arranged and rearranged the condiments on each table. Rita baked a fresh batch of her cinnamon rolls, the only menu item that could legitimately be called excellent, filling the cafe with a warm, sweet aroma that temporarily overpowered the usual scent of burnt coffee and old grease. By the time a sleek black car pulled up to the curb outside, the Bluebird looked as good as it possibly could, which was to say, decent, but still clearly a relic of a bygone era. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched the driver step out, a compact man in a dark suit who moved with military precision. He opened the rear passenger door, and I found myself holding my breath. The man who emerged moved with an ease that seemed at odds with the formality of his appearance. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. But it was the way he carried himself that made my throat go dry, a kind of coiled readiness beneath the civilized exterior, like watching a predator pretend to be domesticated. "Oh my God," Rita breathed beside me. "He's so young. I was expecting some old corporate shark, not." She trailed off, apparently at a loss for words. He couldn't have been much older than his mid-30s, with dark hair styled in that deliberately casual way that wealthy men seem to achieve effortlessly. Even from this distance, I could see the sharp angles of his face, the strong jaw, the assessing quality in his gaze as he surveyed the cafe's exterior. "Positions," Rita hissed, smoothing down her apron one last time before plastering on her most welcoming smile. "Remember, we're cheerful, efficient, and absolutely irreplaceable." I moved to stand behind the counter, trying to look like the model employee despite my racing heart and the fresh worry that had settled like a stone in my stomach. If this man decided to close the Bluebird, where would I go? I had no degree, no special skills, just 18 months of experience slinging coffee in a dying cafe. The job market in this city was brutal even for qualified candidates. The door chimed as he entered, and somehow that familiar sound seemed different, weighted with significance. He paused just inside the threshold, his gaze sweeping the interior with the same assessing quality I'd noticed outside. Everything about him screamed money and power. The perfect cut of his suit, the Italian leather shoes, the watch on his wrist that was probably worth more than Rita's car. But it was his eyes that caught me, held me frozen in place like a deer in headlights. Dark, intelligent, and unnervingly focused. They missed nothing, I realized, taking in every detail of the shabby cafe, cataloging our worth or lack thereof in seconds. "Welcome to the Bluebird." Rita's voice had that artificially bright quality people used when they were terrified. "I'm Rita Harper, the manager. We're so pleased to finally meet you, Mr. Blackwood," he supplied, his voice deep and smooth, with just a hint of something else beneath it, an accent he'd learned to suppress. "Thomas Blackwood." "Mr. Blackwood, wonderful." Rita was wringing her hands again, and I wished desperately that she would stop because it made us look desperate, which of course we were. "Can I get you some coffee? We just baked fresh cinnamon rolls, our specialty. Tessa, get Mr. Blackwood some coffee." That's when he looked directly at me for the first time, and the intensity of his gaze nearly made me step backward. For a moment, neither of us moved, and in that suspended second, I had the strangest sensation of recognition, as if I should know him from somewhere. But that was impossible. Men like Thomas Blackwood didn't occupy the same world as women like me. "Please," he said, breaking the moment. That would be excellent, miss. Blake, I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. Tessa Blake. His eyes lingered on me for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he turned his attention back to Rita. Perhaps we could sit down. I'd like to discuss the future of the Bluebird. My hands trembled slightly as I prepared his coffee. Using the good china Rita had insisted we set out, the cups we normally reserved for the health inspector's visits. I could hear Rita's nervous chatter as she guided him to table 4, the one we'd so carefully prepared. The sunlight streaming through the now clean windows caught the angles of his face, highlighting the sharp planes of his cheekbones and the firm set of his mouth. When I brought over the coffee, along with cream and sugar even though he hadn't asked for either, I found myself studying him more closely. Up close, he was even more striking, but also, somehow, harder. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly swept the room, even while appearing to give Rita his full attention. That suggested danger beneath the civilized surface. Thank you, Tessa, he said, as I set down the cup, and hearing my name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. I stepped back quickly, retreating to the counter where I could observe without being obvious. Rita was explaining the cafe's history, talking too fast, her hands gesturing wildly. Mr. Blackwood listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, occasionally asking questions in that measured tone that suggested he already knew the answers and was merely confirming them. The construction workers had abandoned any pretense of not listening, their coffee growing cold as they openly stared. Even Mr. Chen had lowered his newspaper, his shrewd old eyes tracking Thomas Blackwood's every movement. We all understood what was at stake in this moment. I found myself staring at Mr. Blackwood's hands as he lifted the coffee cup, noting the way his fingers curved around the porcelain with surprising delicacy for someone so clearly powerful. No wedding ring, I observed, then immediately felt stupid for noticing. What difference did it make if the man who might destroy our livelihoods was married or not? He took a sip of the coffee, and I held my breath, irrationally hoping that somehow our burnt, bitter brew would impress him. His expression remained neutral, though I thought I detected the slightest tightening around his eyes. Rita, he said, setting down the cup with deliberate care. I appreciate you taking the time to show me around, but I should be honest with you about my intentions for the Bluebird. The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Rita's face paled, and I felt my own stomach twist into knots. This was it, the moment when our worst fears would be confirmed. I've purchased this entire block, he continued, his voice neither apologetic nor cruel, simply matter of fact. The buildings, the businesses, everything. I have plans for redevelopment that will transform this waterfront area into something more befitting its location. So you're closing us down, Rita said flatly, all the artificial brightness draining from her voice. Before he could respond, the cafe door chimed again, and a woman entered who was clearly cut from the same expensive cloth as Thomas Blackwood. She wore a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than I made in a year, her dark hair styled in an elegant updo, her makeup flawless. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. Thomas, she said, her voice carrying a note of impatience. We're going to be late for the Henderson meeting. He glanced at his watch, a gesture so casual, yet somehow conveying absolute authority. I'm aware, Victoria. Give me 5 minutes. Victoria's gaze swept the cafe with barely concealed disdain, lingering for a moment on me in my cheap uniform before dismissing me as beneath notice. 5 minutes, she confirmed, then stepped back outside, pulling out her phone as she went. The interruption seemed to have shifted something in the room's energy. When Thomas Blackwood returned his attention to Rita, there was a new distance in his manner, as if he'd remembered who and what he was. I'd like to speak with you privately, Rita, he said, rising from his seat with fluid grace. Perhaps in your office. Rita nodded mutely and led him toward the back. As he passed the counter where I stood frozen, he paused for just a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting mine once more. And in that brief moment, I could have sworn I saw something flicker in his expression. Regret? Curiosity? It was gone before I could identify it, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it entirely. The moment they disappeared into Rita's cramped office at the back of the kitchen, the cafe erupted in anxious whispers. The construction workers started speculating about severance packages. Mrs. Patterson clutched her coffee cup like a lifeline, and Mr. Chen simply shook his head sadly, as if he'd seen this story play out too many times before. I busied myself with cleaning that didn't need to be done, wiping down counters I'd already wiped, straightening menus that were already straight. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Where would I find another job? How long would my meager savings last? What would I do if I couldn't make rent? 3 days passed in agonizing uncertainty. Rita had emerged from that meeting with Thomas Blackwood pale and tight-lipped, refusing to discuss what had transpired beyond a terse, "We'll know more soon." The not knowing was worse than any definitive answer could have been, leaving us all suspended in a state of anxious limbo while we served coffee and pretended everything was normal. I caught myself thinking about Thomas Blackwood at odd moments, replaying that brief interaction in my mind like a film reel I couldn't stop. The way he'd looked at me, really looked, as if I was something more than just another minimum wage worker in his path to profit. It was ridiculous, this fixation on a man who held my livelihood in his hands, like something disposable. Yet I couldn't shake the memory of his dark eyes, the barely perceptible softening of his expression when I'd smiled. On the 4th morning, everything changed. I arrived for my shift at 6:30 as usual, my breath misting in the early November cold, to find Rita already inside, sitting alone in one of the booths with her head in her hands. The cafe lights were off except for the dim emergency lighting, casting her in shadows that made her look decades older. "Rita?" I flipped the main lights on, flooding the space with harsh fluorescent brightness. "What's wrong?" She looked up, and I was shocked to see tears streaming down her face. In 18 months of working together, through health inspector violations and broken equipment, and the endless struggle of keeping the Bluebird afloat, I'd never seen Rita cry. "He bought everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The whole block, like he said. The hardware store, the laundromat, Chen's bookshop, all of it. Everyone's being bought out or forced out through rent, increases they can't possibly afford." My legs felt suddenly weak, and I sank into the booth across from her. "And us? We're closing in 2 weeks. He's offering severance, 3 months' pay for everyone, which is more generous than he needed to be." She laughed bitterly. "I suppose I should be grateful. Most corporate raiders don't even offer that much. 3 months' pay. It sounded like a fortune until you did the math, until you realized it was barely enough to cover rent and food, while job hunting in a market that was already oversaturated with people far more qualified than me." The panic that had been my constant companion these past few days crystallized into something sharp and painful in my chest. "What will you do?" I asked quietly. Rita wiped her eyes with her apron, that familiar gesture somehow heartbreaking in its ordinariness. "My sister's been after me to move to Florida, help her run her bed and breakfast. I suppose now's as good a time as any." She reached across the table and gripped my hand. "What about you, Tessa? Do you have family? Somewhere you can go?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 19, leaving me alone in the world with nothing but student debt from a college degree I'd never finished, and the weight of grief that had taken years to even begin to process. The Bluebird had been my anchor, the one constant in a life that had been upended too many times. "You're young," Rita said with forced optimism. "Smart. You'll land on your feet." Would I? I wanted to believe her, but the statistics weren't in my favor. Young, unskilled workers were a dime a dozen in this city. What made me special? What made me worth hiring over the hundreds of other desperate people competing for the same scarce positions? We opened the cafe as usual that morning, going through the familiar motions with the hollow feeling of people performing a ritual that had lost its meaning. The regulars trickled in, and word spread quickly about the closure. Mrs. Patterson cried into her coffee. The construction workers railed against gentrification and corporate greed. Mr. Chen simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting this all along, and quietly began boxing up his belongings from his corner booth. I was refilling the coffee maker, my movements automatic after 18 months of repetition, when the door chimed, and I glanced up out of habit. My breath caught in my throat. Thomas Blackwood stood in the doorway, but this time he was alone, without the imperious Victoria or the intimidating driver. He wore dark jeans and a black sweater instead of a suit, the casual attire somehow making him more rather than less imposing. In the morning light streaming through the windows, I could see details I'd missed before. The faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, the weariness in his eyes that suggested he carried burdens invisible to outsiders. The cafe fell silent. Every eye turned toward him with expressions ranging from hostility to despair. He seemed to feel the weight of their stares, but didn't flinch, his composure absolute as he walked directly to the counter where I stood frozen. "Tessa," he said, my name a statement rather than a question. "I'd like to speak with you privately if you have a moment." Rita emerged from the kitchen, her face hardening when she saw him. "Mr. Blackwood, I hope you're satisfied with yourself." "Rita." He inclined his head in acknowledgement, his expression neutral but not unkind. "I understand you're upset, but I need to speak with Miss Blake. It's important." "She's working," Rita said flatly, moving to stand beside me in a show of solidarity that made my throat tight. "If you want to discuss employment matters, you can talk to me first." "It's not about employment." His eyes never left mine, dark and intense and utterly unreadable. "It's personal." The word hung in the air, heavy with implications I couldn't begin to understand. Personal? What could Thomas Blackwood possibly have to discuss with me on a personal level? We'd exchanged maybe 3 sentences total, yet something in his expression suggested he was entirely serious. "Tessa, you don't have to talk to him if you don't want to," Rita said, her protective instinct flaring despite her own distress. "He might own this building, but he doesn't own you." She was right, of course. I could refuse. I could tell him to leave, to take his money and his plans and his devastating presence elsewhere. But curiosity was a powerful force, and beneath my anger at what he was doing to the Bluebird, to all of us, I found myself desperately wanting to understand. What did he want? Why me? "It's okay, Rita," I heard myself say. "I'll talk to him." I untied my apron with trembling fingers and led him to the back corner booth, the one furthest from the counter where we might have some semblance of privacy, despite every person in the cafe watching our every move. We sat across from each other, the scarred formica table between us feeling like both barrier and bridge. Up close, in the unforgiving morning light, Thomas Blackwood was even more striking. His features were too sharp to be conventionally handsome, all hard angles and intensity. But there was something magnetic about him, a gravitational pull that I felt even as I resented it. "I know you must think I'm a monster," he began, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the eavesdroppers. "Closing down the Bluebird, displacing the community. You wouldn't be wrong." His bluntness surprised me. I'd expected justifications, business talk about market forces and property values. Then why do it? The question came out sharper than I'd intended. "These people, this place, it matters. Can't you see that?" "I do see it." He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his eyes remaining alert, watchful. But what you don't see is the alternative. This neighborhood is being swallowed by development, whether I'm involved or not. At least with my project, there's a plan, a vision for something that serves the community, rather than just extracting profit from it. How noble, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. You're destroying people's livelihoods for their own good. I'm offering everyone fair market value plus relocation assistance. More than fair, actually. A flash of something, irritation perhaps, crossed his features. But that's not why I wanted to talk to you, Tessa. The way he said my name, with that slight emphasis that made it sound intimate, sent an unwelcome shiver through me. I wrapped my hands around the coffee mug I'd brought with me, seeking comfort in its warmth. 4 days ago, you smiled at me, he continued, his gaze locked on mine with unsettling intensity. When you brought me coffee, you smiled. Do you remember? I blinked, thrown by the apparent non sequitur. I smile at all the customers. It's part of the job. No. He shook his head slowly. This was different. You weren't performing, weren't putting on the service industry mask. You smiled at me like I was just a person, like you were genuinely pleased to see me happy about something as simple as a cup of coffee in a neighborhood cafe. My mind raced back to that moment. Had I smiled? I must have. It was automatic, but I couldn't remember it being anything special. Anything that would warrant this strange conversation. I don't understand, I said carefully. Why does that matter? He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming once against the table in a gesture that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. Do you know what it's like to go through life with everyone wanting something from you? To be surrounded by people who smile at you because of what you can give them, what you represent, never because of who you actually are. The question was rhetorical, but it opened a window into something I hadn't expected. Loneliness. Thomas Blackwood, with his money and power and devastating presence, was lonely. That smile, he continued, was the first genuine human interaction I've had in longer than I can remember. You didn't know who I was, what I could do for or against you. You just smiled because in that moment you were happy. And it made me realize how starved I've been for something real. I should have been moved by this confession. Instead, I felt anger bubbling up, hot and righteous. So you're closing down the cafe? Taking away my job, my income, making my life exponentially harder because I smiled at you? No. His voice was firm, almost sharp. I'm closing the cafe because it's part of a business plan that was set in motion months ago. But I am making you an offer because of that smile. An offer? Suspicion crept into my voice. What kind of offer? Thomas Blackwood reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, sliding it across the table toward me. The cardstock was heavy, expensive, embossed with gold lettering that read Blackwood Enterprises and listed a downtown address in one of the city's most prestigious buildings. I'm opening a new cafe as part of the development project, he explained. High-end, but still accessible to the community. I want someone who understands what makes a place like the Bluebird special, who can translate that essence into something new. I want you to manage it. I stared at the card as if it might bite me. You want me to manage your cafe? I'm 22 years old with 18 months of experience as a waitress. Why would you possibly want me in a management position? Because you care. He said it simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. You care about the people, about creating a space that matters. That can't be taught, Tessa. The rest, the business management skills, the operational knowledge, those can be learned. But that fundamental caring about creating something meaningful, that's rare. It was tempting. God, it was so tempting. A management position would mean better pay, benefits, a career path instead of just a job. It would mean security, stability. all the things I'd been desperately craving. But something about it felt wrong. Like accepting blood money, betraying Rita and all the others whose livelihoods he was destroying. "And if I say no?" I asked. "Then I wish you the best in your future endeavors." He stood smoothly, leaving the business card on the table between us. "But Tessa, understand this. Change is coming to this neighborhood whether you're part of it or not. You can be swept away by it, or you can help shape it into something worthwhile." He moved toward the door, and I found myself calling after him before I could think better of it. "Why do you care so much about one smile from a random waitress?" Thomas Blackwood paused, turning back to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Because in that moment, you made me remember what it felt like to be human, and I'm not willing to lose that feeling without a fight." Then he was gone, the door chiming behind him, leaving me with a business card and a choice that felt impossible to make. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. Rita questioned me repeatedly about what Thomas Blackwood had wanted, but I found myself unable to fully explain. How could I tell her that the man who was destroying her life's work had offered me a golden opportunity? That his motivation seemed to be nothing more complex or sinister than appreciation for a smile I couldn't even remember giving. I went home that night to my studio apartment, a cramped space in a building that was only marginally better than condemned, and sat on my second-hand couch staring at the business card. The logical choice was clear. Take the job. I'd be stupid not to. But logic didn't account for loyalty, for the bone-deep sense that accepting his offer would be a betrayal of everything the Bluebird represented. My phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. An unknown number, but I answered anyway. "Tessa Blake?" The voice was female, crisp and professional. "I'm calling on behalf of Thomas Blackwood. He wanted me to provide you with additional details about the management position." "I haven't decided yet," I said quickly. "Of course. But Mr. Blackwood felt you should have all the information before making your decision. The position offers a salary of $75,000 annually, full health benefits, 4 weeks paid vacation, and a performance bonus structure that could add an additional $20,000 to $30,000 per year." The numbers hit me like a physical blow. $75,000. I currently made 23. The difference was staggering, life-changing, the kind of money that would mean never worrying about making rent, never having to choose between food and medication, never lying awake at night calculating how many more weeks I could survive on my dwindling savings. "There's also a signing bonus," the woman continued. $25,000, payable immediately upon acceptance of the position. Mr. Blackwood understands you may have concerns about the transition period and wants to ensure you're taken care of financially." "That's very generous," I managed, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "He also asked me to tell you that the offer expires in 72 hours. Not as pressure, but because he needs to move forward with hiring if you decline. He wanted you to have time to consider, but not so much time that you overthink yourself into paralysis. He was right about that at least. Give me too much time, and I'd talk myself out of anything that seemed too good to be true. And this definitely seemed too good to be true." After I hung up, I pulled out my laptop and did something I should have done days ago. I researched Thomas Blackwood. What I found was illuminating and troubling in equal measure. Thomas Blackwood, 37, CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, a development company with projects across the country. His net worth was estimated somewhere in the hundreds of millions, possibly billions, though the exact figures were unclear. He'd built his fortune through a combination of savvy investments and ruthless business practices, acquiring distressed properties and transforming them into luxury developments. But there was more. Thomas Blackwood was known for his philanthropy, for creating community spaces within his developments, for paying his workers well above minimum wage. He wasn't a typical corporate raider. He was something more complex, a man who seemed to genuinely care about creating value beyond just monetary profit, even as he displaced existing communities to do it. I found photos of him at charity galas, always with beautiful women on his arm but never the same one twice. Articles described him as intensely private, brilliant, and occasionally ruthless when crossed. One interview quoted him saying, "I don't do anything without a reason. If I'm investing in a project, it's because I see potential that others have missed." What potential had he seen in me? What had that smile revealed that made me worth such a substantial investment? I didn't sleep that night, tossing and turning in my uncomfortable bed as I weighed my options. Accept the job and have financial security, but feel like I'd betrayed everyone at the Bluebird. Decline the job and maintain my principles, but likely end up unemployed and desperate within months. By morning, I still hadn't decided. I went to work at the Bluebird in a fog, going through the motions mechanically. Rita noticed immediately. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "What did Blackwood say to you yesterday?" I hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. I told her everything. The job offer, the salary, the signing bonus, my conflicted feelings about accepting. To my surprise, Rita didn't look betrayed. Instead, she looked thoughtful, almost relieved. "Tessa, you should take it. But, no buts." She gripped my shoulders firmly. "Listen to me. I'm 58 years old. I've had a good run with the Bluebird and I have options. You're 22 with your whole life ahead of you. If someone's offering you an opportunity like this, you grab it with both hands." "It feels like blood money," I confessed quietly. "It's not blood money. It's business." Rita's voice was gentle but firm. "The Bluebird was going down anyway, Tessa. We both know it. We've been barely breaking even for years. Blackwood buying the property didn't kill us. We were already dying. At least this way something good comes out of it." "You really think I should accept?" "I think you'd be crazy not to. And I think Thomas Blackwood saw something in you that you don't see in yourself yet. Potential." She smiled sadly. "Take the job, Tessa. Make something beautiful. Honor what the Bluebird was by creating something new that matters just as much." 3 days later, I stood in the lobby of Blackwood Enterprises, clutching my worn purse and trying not to feel intimidated by the soaring ceilings and marble floors. The receptionist, a polished woman who made me feel acutely aware of my discount store clothes, directed me to the executive floor. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by another assistant, this one male, and just as polished as the receptionist. He led me through a maze of hallways to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Thomas Blackwood stood with his back to the door, looking out at the skyline. He turned when I entered, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. In his element, surrounded by the trappings of his power and success, he was even more imposing than he'd been in the Bluebird. "Tessa," he said, and I heard genuine pleasure in his voice. "I'm glad you came." "I'm accepting your offer," I said, before I could lose my nerve. "The management position. I'll do it." A smile crossed his face, transforming his features from merely striking to genuinely handsome. "Excellent. I promise you won't regret this decision." As I shook his hand, sealing the deal that would change the entire trajectory of my life, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped onto a path I didn't fully understand, one that would lead somewhere I couldn't yet see. I just hoped I was ready for wherever it led. The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind that left me dizzy and disoriented, as if I'd stepped through a portal into an alternate reality where I mattered, where my opinions held weight, where I was more than just another disposable minimum wage worker. The signing bonus hit my bank account the day after I accepted Thomas Blackwood's offer, and I'd stared at my phone for a full 10 minutes, refreshing the banking app over and over to confirm it was real. $25,000. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. The Bluebird closed its doors for the final time on a gray November afternoon, and I stood with Rita and the regulars for one last cup of coffee, all of us pretending we weren't crying. Mrs. Patterson hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering that I should make her proud. Mr. Chen gave me a battered copy of a business management book that he said had served him well in his younger days. Even the construction workers shook my hand, gruff in their good wishes but genuine in their hope that I wouldn't forget where I came from. Rita was the hardest goodbye. We'd worked together for 18 months, and she'd been more than just a boss. She'd been a lifeline during the darkest period of my life, offering stability and purpose when I'd had neither. "You're going to do amazing things, Tessa," she said as we locked the cafe doors for the last time, both of us crying openly now. "Just promise me you'll stay yourself, okay? Don't let all that money and power change who you are at your core." I promised, though I wasn't sure it was a promise I could keep. How could I not be changed by such a dramatic shift in circumstances? I was already changing, could feel it happening in small ways. The confidence that came from financial security, the way I carried myself differently, knowing I had options, the subtle shift in how I viewed the world now that survival wasn't my primary concern. My first official day at Blackwood Enterprises started at 8 a.m. sharp. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in new clothes that I'd purchased with a fraction of the signing bonus, a simple black sheath dress and blazer that I hoped struck the right balance between professional and approachable. The same polished receptionist from my interview directed me to the 15th floor, where I found myself in a conference room with 5 other people, all of whom looked far more qualified and competent than I felt. "Welcome to the Blackwood team," said a woman who introduced herself as Patricia Weaver, Director of Operations. She was in her late 50s, with steel gray hair cut in a severe bob and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're here because Mr. Blackwood sees potential in you, but potential means nothing without execution. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to teach you everything you need to know about managing a high-end hospitality operation." What followed was the most intense educational experience of my life. We covered everything from inventory management and scheduling to customer service philosophy and financial planning. I learned about profit margins and food costs, about hiring practices and employee retention strategies, about creating ambiance and managing difficult customers. The information came at me in a relentless flood, and I filled notebook after notebook with notes, staying up late every night studying like I was back in college. Patricia was demanding, sometimes brutally so, but I came to respect her thoroughness. She didn't coddle or praise easily, but when I got something right, her brief nod of approval felt like winning a gold medal. 2 weeks into the training, Thomas Blackwood himself appeared in one of our sessions. I'd seen him only once since accepting the position, a brief encounter in the elevator where he'd asked how my training was progressing. I'd mumbled something about it being intense, but good, acutely aware of the other people in the elevator watching our interaction with undisguised curiosity. Now he stood at the front of the conference room, commanding attention without seeming to try. Today's topic was creating authentic community spaces in commercial developments, and apparently, this was a subject he felt strongly about. "The mistake most developers make," he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet room, "is assuming that community happens naturally if you just provide the space. It doesn't. Community requires intentional cultivation, careful attention to what people actually need versus what we think they need." He spoke for 30 minutes without notes, describing projects he'd worked on around the country, successes and failures, lessons learned. I found myself captivated not just by what he was saying, but by the passion behind it. This wasn't a businessman going through the motions. This was someone who genuinely cared about creating spaces that mattered. When he asked for questions, I raised my hand before I could think better of it. How do you balance the commercial requirements of a project with the community's needs? Because those don't always align. His eyes found mine across the room, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or approval. That's the crucial question, isn't it? The answer is that you don't balance them as competing interests. You integrate them. A thriving community space generates foot traffic, which benefits the commercial tenants. Happy commercial tenants provide services the community values, which strengthens the community. It's symbiotic, not oppositional, when done correctly. After the session ended, he approached my table while the others filed out. "Good question, Tessa. You're thinking about the right things. I'm trying, I admitted. Though honestly, I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose. There's so much I don't know. That's why we're training you. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. I'm having dinner with the architect for the new cafe project tomorrow night. I'd like you to join us. You should have input on the design since you'll be managing the space. The invitation caught me off guard. Tomorrow? Yes, of course. What time? 7. I'll have my driver pick you up. He pulled out his phone. What's your address? I gave it to him, watching as he typed it into his contacts with quick, efficient movements. When he glanced up and saw my expression, he raised an eyebrow. Is there a problem? No, it's just, you don't have to send a driver. I can take the bus downtown. It's not a big deal. Something about my protest seemed to amuse him. Tessa, you work for me now. Your time is valuable, and I'm not going to waste it having you spend 2 hours on public transportation when I can have you picked up in 20 minutes. Besides, the restaurant I've chosen isn't easily accessible by bus. Of course it wasn't. I was learning that Thomas Blackwood's world operated by different rules than the one I'd inhabited, where considerations like bus routes and transfer times were irrelevant because drivers and private cars eliminated such mundane concerns. The next evening, I stood in my small apartment staring at my meager wardrobe with something approaching panic. What did one wear to a business dinner at the kind of restaurant that required a driver to reach? My new work clothes seemed too plain, but I had nothing else that was even remotely appropriate. In the end, I chose the black dress I'd worn to my first day of training, adding the only piece of jewelry I owned that wasn't costume, a delicate silver necklace that had been my mother's. Looking at myself in the mirror, I didn't look completely out of place. Maybe a bit like I was playing dress up, but not embarrassingly so. The driver arrived precisely at 6:40, giving us 20 minutes to navigate downtown traffic. The car was a sleek black sedan with leather seats that probably cost more than 3 months of my old salary. I sat stiffly in the back, acutely aware that I didn't belong in such luxury, that I was an imposter who'd somehow conned her way into a life she hadn't earned. The restaurant was called Lumineux, occupying the top floor of one of the city's most prestigious hotels. The entrance alone was intimidating. A lobby of marble and gold, doormen in elaborate uniforms, a general atmosphere of exclusivity that made my palms sweat. The maitre d' greeted me by name when I approached the host stand, which meant Thomas had called ahead, and led me to a private dining room where Thomas and another man were already seated. Both men stood when I entered, and I was struck again by Thomas's commanding presence. He wore a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, his hair styled with that deliberately casual perfection that spoke of expensive barbers and quality products. Next to him, the other man looked almost ordinary, despite being objectively handsome. Late 40s, graying at the temples, dressed well, but not ostentatiously. "Tessa," Thomas said, moving to pull out a chair for me with old-fashioned courtesy that somehow didn't feel outdated. "Thank you for joining us. This is Michael Chen, the architect for our project." I shook Michael's hand, noting his firm grip and assessing gaze. "Chen? Any relation to Arthur Chen, who ran the bookshop? My uncle." Michael's smile was warm, genuine. "Tom told me you worked at the Bluebird. My uncle mentioned you in his last call, said you were one of the good ones." The connection surprised and pleased me, creating an unexpected thread of continuity between my old life and this new one. We settled into our seats, and a server appeared immediately with menus that had no prices listed, always a sign of the kind of establishment where money wasn't meant to be a consideration. "I took the liberty of ordering wine," Thomas said, gesturing to the bottle being poured by a sommelier who treated it with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "But if you'd prefer something else." "Wine is fine," I said, though I had no idea if it was good wine or merely expensive wine, or if there was even a difference. The sommelier poured a small amount into Thomas's glass first, waited for his nod of approval, then filled all 3 glasses with a liquid that glowed ruby red in the candlelight. Michael launched into a discussion of the project, pulling out a tablet to show me preliminary designs. The cafe would occupy a corner location on the ground floor of the new development, with large windows on 2 sides, high ceilings, and an open floor plan that managed to feel both spacious and intimate. I wanted to honor the spirit of the Bluebird, Thomas said, leaning forward to point at specific elements of the design. Not to replicate it, that would be dishonest, but to capture what made it special. A place where people feel welcome, where regulars can claim their favorite spots, where community happens organically. As Michael and Thomas discussed design elements, I found myself growing more confident, offering opinions about sightlines and seating arrangements, about the importance of creating distinct zones for different types of customers. To my surprise, both men listened attentively, with Thomas occasionally making notes on his own tablet. The food, when it arrived, was extraordinary. Delicate compositions that were as much art as sustenance. I'd never experienced fine dining before, and each course was a revelation, flavors and textures combining in ways I hadn't imagined possible. Yet despite the elegance of the setting and the meal, the conversation remained grounded, focused on practical considerations and genuine enthusiasm for creating something meaningful. It wasn't until dessert, a chocolate creation so beautiful I almost didn't want to eat it, that the conversation shifted to more personal territory. Michael excused himself to take a phone call, leaving Thomas and me alone for the first time since the dinner began. "You did well tonight," Thomas said, his dark eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Your insights about community dynamics were valuable." Michael was impressed. "I mostly just told him what I observed at the Bluebird," I demurred. "Nothing revolutionary." "You translated lived experience into actionable design principles. That's exactly why I wanted you on this project, Tessa." He paused, swirling the wine in his glass. "You've been quiet about your background. Patricia mentioned you never finished college. May I ask what happened?" The question was gentle but direct, and I found myself answering despite my usual reticence about this subject. "My parents died in a car accident during my sophomore year. I came home for the funeral and just never went back. I couldn't focus, couldn't see the point. I was drowning in grief and student debt, and dropping out seemed like the only option. I'm sorry." The sympathy in his voice sounded genuine, not performative. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was, still is, sometimes." I took a sip of wine, using the moment to collect myself. The Bluebird gave me a reason to get up in the morning, a place to go where I had purpose. That's why I struggled so much with accepting this position. It felt like betraying the thing that saved me. "And now?" Thomas asked quietly. "How do you feel about it now?" I considered the question carefully, surprised to find that my answer had shifted over the past few weeks. I think Rita was right. The Bluebird was dying anyway, and maybe this is a way to honor what it was by creating something new that serves the same essential purpose. Or at least, I hope it can be that. It can be, if you make it so. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with that intense focus that made me feel simultaneously exposed and seen. "I don't make many impulsive decisions, Tessa. Offering you this position was calculated based on potential I saw in you. But keeping you in it, investing in your training, believing you can successfully manage this project, that's based on what I'm observing now. And what I'm observing confirms my initial assessment." The compliment warmed me more than the wine had, filling me with a confidence I hadn't felt since my parents died. Someone believed in me. Someone saw value in me beyond my ability to pour coffee and smile at customers. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Michael returned, and the conversation shifted back to project logistics. We spent another hour going over timelines and vendor selections before Thomas finally signaled for the check. When I reached for my purse out of habit, Thomas gave me a look that was both amused and slightly reproving. "This is a business dinner, Tessa. The company covers it." Of course it did. Just another reminder that I'd stepped into a world where the rules I'd lived by no longer applied. The driver took Michael home first, then continued to my apartment. Thomas, who I'd assumed would be dropped off at some luxury penthouse, remained in the car, apparently intending to see me safely home. The gesture felt oddly protective, almost old-fashioned, and I wasn't sure how to interpret it. When we pulled up to my building, with its cracked concrete steps and peeling paint, I felt a flush of embarrassment. The contrast between his world and mine had never been more starkly visible. "Thank you for dinner," I said, reaching for the door handle. "And for including me in the design process. It means a lot. Tessa." His voice stopped me. When I turned back, he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You don't need to be embarrassed about where you live. We all start somewhere. What matters is where we're going." The kindness in his words shouldn't have affected me so strongly, but it did, creating a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with professional gratitude and everything to do with something more complicated, more dangerous. "Good night, Mr. Blackwood," I said softly, then corrected myself. "Thomas," his lips curved into a slight smile. "Good night, Tessa." Over the following weeks, our professional relationship deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. Thomas was involved in every aspect of the cafe project, from menu development to hiring decisions, and that meant we spent considerable time together. Late meetings in his office, site visits to the construction location, dinners that were ostensibly business, but felt increasingly personal as we learned each other's rhythms and preferences. I told myself it was just professional respect, just gratitude for the opportunity he'd given me. But I couldn't deny the way my heart rate increased when he entered a room, the way I found myself dressing more carefully on days I knew I'd see him, the way his rare smiles felt like victories I'd earned. The cafe opened in early spring, and it was everything I'd hoped for and more. We'd named it The Second Cup, a nod to the Bluebird's legacy, and from the first day, it felt right. The regulars from the old cafe found their way to us, mixing with new customers drawn by the beautiful space and excellent coffee. Mrs. Patterson claimed a corner table by the window. Mr. Chen came daily to read his newspapers. Even the construction workers stopped by, though they complained good-naturedly about the higher prices. Thomas attended the opening, staying in the background but watching everything with those intense dark eyes. When he caught my gaze across the crowded room, the pride in his expression made my chest tight with emotion. I'd done this. We'd created something meaningful together. As closing time approached, he lingered after the last customers left, helping me straighten chairs in a gesture that felt incongruous coming from a billionaire developer. "You should be proud," he said quietly. "This place, what you've built here, it's exactly what I envisioned when I first saw you smile in the Bluebird." "We built it together," I corrected, because it was true. Without his resources, his vision, his unwavering support, none of this would have existed. He moved closer, and suddenly the air between us felt charged with something I'd been trying to ignore for months. "Tessa, I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, my phone rang shrilly, shattering the moment. I glanced at the screen and saw Rita's name. Felt a flash of guilt for how rarely we'd spoken since she'd moved to Florida. "I'm sorry, it's Rita. I should—" "Take it," he said, stepping back, and I thought I saw disappointment flicker across his features. The call was brief. Rita checking in on the opening, her voice warm with pride and just a hint of nostalgia. When I hung up, Thomas had moved to the window, his back to me, hands in his pockets as he stared out at the street. "She wanted to know how opening day went," I explained. She's happy for me. As she should be. He turned, and in the dim lighting of the cafe, his features were all shadows and angles. Tessa, I've tried to keep this professional. You work for me, and there's a power dynamic that makes anything else complicated. But I can't pretend anymore that my interest in you is purely professional. My heart hammered against my ribs. Thomas, that smile, that day in the Bluebird, it wasn't just that you were kind to a stranger. It was that you saw me, really saw me, before you knew anything about my money or my power. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since. I should have been practical, should have considered the implications and complications. But standing there in the cafe we'd built together, looking at this man who'd changed my entire life, I found I didn't want to be practical. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you either, I admitted quietly. The distance between us closed in 3 long strides, and then his hands were framing my face with surprising gentleness, his thumbs brushing my cheekbones as if I was something precious and fragile. Tell me if this is a mistake, he murmured, his breath warm against my lips. It probably is, I whispered back, but I don't care. When he kissed me, it felt like falling and flying simultaneously, terrifying and exhilarating and inevitable. His lips were surprisingly soft, moving against mine with a hunger that had been building for months, and I responded with equal fervor, my hands fisting in his expensive shirt, pulling him closer. We broke apart only when the need for air became urgent, both of us breathing hard, foreheads pressed together in the darkness of the cafe. I've wanted to do that for so long, he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. Since the Bluebird? I asked, only half joking. Since the Bluebird, he confirmed, and the admission made me laugh, a sound of pure joy that echoed in the empty space. The next 6 months passed in a blur of happiness I hadn't known was possible. Thomas and I kept our relationship quiet at first, both of us aware of how it might look, the billionaire boss dating his young employee. But eventually it became impossible to hide. The way he looked at me, the way I lit up whenever he entered a room, these things didn't stay secret for long. Patricia confronted me about it one afternoon, her expression stern but not unkind. Are you being careful, Tessa? What do you mean? I mean that Thomas Blackwood is a good man, but he's also a complicated one. He operates in a world you're only beginning to understand, and that world can be dangerous. I'd dismissed her concern at the time, attributing it to overprotectiveness, but her words would come back to haunt me sooner than I could have imagined. The cafe thrived, becoming exactly what we'd hoped, a gathering place for the community, profitable enough to justify its existence but never losing sight of its essential purpose. I hired carefully, building a team that understood and shared my vision. We hosted book clubs and art shows, offered free coffee to students studying for exams, created a space where people mattered more than their ability to maximize profit per square foot. Thomas was increasingly part of my life outside of work as well. Dinners at restaurants I'd never have dreamed of entering, weekends at his lake house, charity galas where I wore borrowed designer gowns and tried not to feel like an imposter. His world was glamorous, but also exhausting, filled with people who smiled while calculating what they could gain from you, who measured worth in net value and social connections. But when it was just us, when we escaped to quiet moments away from the demands of his business and social obligations, he was simply Thomas, thoughtful, surprisingly funny, carrying wounds from his own past that he revealed slowly, piece by careful piece. He'd built his empire from nothing, he told me one night, growing up poor in a neighborhood, not unlike the one where the Bluebird had stood, driven by the desperation to never be powerless again. Sometimes I look at what I've become, and I'm not sure I recognize myself, he confessed, his head in my lap as we lay on his couch, my fingers running through his hair. The money. The power. It changes you whether you want it to or not. You created the second cup, I reminded him gently. You could have built luxury condos and maximized profit, but you chose to create something that serves the community. That's still you. Thomas, the boy from the poor neighborhood who remembers what it's like to need a place that feels like home. He'd pulled me down into a kiss then, one that communicated gratitude and affection and need in equal measure. But fairy tales, I was learning, didn't exist in the real world. They were disrupted by reality, by complications, by the inescapable truth that different worlds weren't meant to merge seamlessly. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday evening in late summer. I was closing the cafe when 3 men entered just as I was about to lock the door. Something about them set off alarm bells immediately. The calculated way they moved, the cold assessment in their eyes, the sense of coiled violence barely contained. "We're closed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're not here for coffee, Miss Blake," the largest one said, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't place. "We're here to deliver a message for Thomas Blackwood." Fear spiked through me, sharp and immediate. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play stupid. Everyone knows you're his girl." He moved closer, and I instinctively backed up until I hit the counter. "Tell him that Konstantin Volkov remembers. Tell him that debts get paid eventually, one way or another." "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand. You just need to deliver the message." His smile was cold, predatory. "And Miss Blake? Next time we might not be so polite." They left as quickly as they'd arrived, and I stood frozen behind the counter, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial Thomas's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice warm with greeting that died the moment he heard my panicked breathing. "What happened? Tessa, talk to me." I told him everything, my words tumbling over each other in my haste. He was silent for a long moment after I finished, a silence that felt heavy with implications I didn't understand. "Lock the doors and don't leave," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm sending security. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Thomas, who is Konstantin Volkov? What debts was he talking about?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'll explain everything when I get there. Just stay put and stay safe." He arrived in 15 minutes, not 20, accompanied by 2 men built like professional bodyguards. His face was a mask I'd never seen before. Cold, hard, every trace of warmth replaced by something that reminded me uncomfortably of the men who'd threatened me. "Are you hurt?" His hands ran over me, checking for injuries with clinical efficiency. "I'm fine. Just scared. Thomas, what's going on? Who are those people and why are they using me to send you messages?" He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Come with me. We need to talk, and not here." We went to his penthouse, the 2 bodyguards following at a discreet distance. Once inside, Thomas poured himself a drink, scotch, neat, and downed it in one swallow before pouring another. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about my business," he began, still facing the window, his back to me. "The development company is legitimate, but it's not the only thing I do. Some of my investments, some of the deals that built my fortune, they involved people and organizations that operate outside conventional boundaries." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. He turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop. Resignation mixed with regret. "It means that when I was building my empire, I made deals with people who weren't entirely legitimate. Konstantin Volkov was one of them. He's Russian mob, runs operations up and down the East Coast. Years ago, we did business together. I borrowed money from him to finance a project, paid it back with interest as agreed. But Volkov doesn't forget. and he has a long memory for people who've dealt with him. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I gripped the back of the sofa for support. You're telling me you're involved with organized crime? Was involved. Past tense. I've spent the last 5 years extricating myself from those connections, going completely legitimate. But men like Volkov, they don't just let you walk away clean. They look for leverage, for ways to pull you back in or extract payment for your freedom. And I'm leverage, I said flatly, the realization hitting me like ice water. They know you care about me, so they can use me to get to you. Yes. The word was barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Tessa. I never meant for you to be pulled into this. I thought I'd put enough distance between myself and that world, that we'd be safe. I was wrong. I sank onto the sofa, my mind racing through implications I didn't want to consider. This man I loved, who I'd thought I knew, had a past that was dangerous in ways I'd never imagined. The fairy tale was revealed as something darker, more complicated, stained with violence and criminality that couldn't be simply washed away. What do they want? I asked quietly. Money, probably, or a favor. With Volkov, it's always transactional. Thomas moved to sit beside me, careful not to touch me, as if he sensed I needed space. I'll handle this, Tessa. You won't be involved. I'll pay whatever he wants, do whatever necessary to keep you safe. And then what? More people from your past appear with more demands? How many Volkovs are out there, Thomas? How many threats am I supposed to just accept as part of being with you? I don't know, he admitted, and the honesty in his voice was almost worse than a lie would have been. I've tried to clean up my past, to make amends where possible and create distance where amends aren't enough. But you're right. There may be others. This life I've lived, the choices I've made, they have consequences. I stood, needing movement, needing air, needing something to do with the tumultuous emotions roiling through me. I need to think. It's too much, Thomas. I need time to process. Of course. He stood as well, maintaining his careful distance. But Tessa, please let me assign security to you until this is resolved. Whether or not we're together, you're at risk because of me, and I need to know you're protected. I wanted to refuse on principle, to assert my independence and reject his interference in my life. But I wasn't stupid. Those men had scared me, and the thought of facing more threats alone was more terrifying than accepting help from the man whose actions had created the danger in the first place. Fine, I agreed. But I'm going home, and I need space. Don't call me. Don't text me. I'll reach out when I'm ready to talk. The hurt that flashed across his features was visible but quickly suppressed. All right. Marco will drive you home and stay outside your building. He's good at being invisible. You won't even know he's there. The ride home was silent, my mind too full of competing thoughts to make sense of any single one. I'd fallen in love with Thomas Blackwood, believing he was simply a successful businessman with philanthropic tendencies and a soft spot for community spaces. The man I'd discovered tonight was more complicated, darker, carrying a past that cast long shadows into the present. But beneath my fear and anger, I couldn't deny the stubborn persistence of love. I'd seen Thomas at his best, and now it's something closer to his worst, and somehow both versions existed in the same person. The question was whether I could accept all of him, shadows and light together, or whether the darkness was too much to bear. 3 days passed in heavy silence. I went to work at the Second Cup, maintained my routines, and tried to pretend everything was normal, even though Marco's constant presence outside reminded me nothing was normal at all. Thomas kept his word about not contacting me, though I received daily reports from Patricia that he was barely sleeping, throwing himself into work with manic intensity that worried everyone around him. On the 4th morning, everything changed. I woke to pounding on my apartment door, insistent and urgent. Fumbling for my robe, I checked the peephole to see Marco looking uncharacteristically agitated, Miss Blake, open up. We need to move you now. What's happened? Thomas has been shot. He's alive but unconscious, and until we know who's responsible and whether they'll target you next, we're moving you to a secure location. The world tilted sideways. Shot. Thomas had been shot. The words didn't make sense, couldn't be real. Yet Marco's grim expression told me they were absolutely real, and my worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. I let him in, and he gave me 5 minutes to dress and grab essentials before hustling me out to a waiting car. During the drive to an address he wouldn't specify, Marco filled in details. Thomas had been leaving a late meeting when someone fired 3 shots from a passing car. He'd been hit once in the shoulder, was in surgery now, prognosis uncertain, but not immediately life-threatening. Volkov? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We don't know yet. Could be him, could be someone else with a grudge. Mr. Blackwood has enemies. That's the cost of the life he's lived. They took me to a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript suburban home that looked completely ordinary from the outside, but had security measures that would rival a government facility. 2 more guards were stationed inside, and Marco informed me I'd be staying here until the situation was resolved. I want to see him, I said. When he's out of surgery, I need to see Thomas. That's not advisable. I don't care about advisable. The man I love was shot, possibly because of his connection to me. I'm not hiding here while he's alone in a hospital. I surprised myself with the fierceness in my voice, but I meant every word. Whatever reservations I'd had, whatever processing I'd needed to do, they were irrelevant now. Thomas was hurt, possibly dying, and I needed to be there. Marco studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll make arrangements, but you follow my instructions exactly. Understand? No deviations, no arguments. We arrived at the hospital 3 hours later, entering through a service entrance and taking a freight elevator to a private floor that had been essentially commandeered for Thomas's security. The hallways were filled with his people, grim-faced men and women who parted silently to let us pass. Patricia was in the waiting room, her usual composure cracked by worry. When she saw me, relief flooded her features. Tessa, thank God, he's been asking for you, even in and out of consciousness. How is he? Out of surgery. The bullet went through his shoulder, missed major arteries but caused significant tissue damage. He'll recover, but it'll take time. She gripped my hands tightly. He needs to see you, needs to know you're safe. That's all he's talked about, making sure you weren't hurt. They let me into his room, and my breath caught at the sight of him. Thomas lay in the hospital bed looking smaller somehow, diminished by bandages and IV lines and the pallor of blood loss. But his eyes, when they opened and found me, held all the intensity I'd come to know. Tessa. My name was a rasp, barely audible. You're here. You're safe. I moved to his bedside, taking his uninjured hand in both of mine. I'm fine. You're the one who got shot, you idiot. What were you thinking, leaving a meeting alone? A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. Thinking I'd made enough enemies that someone would eventually try to kill me, apparently. This isn't funny, Thomas. No, it's not. The smile faded, replaced by something more serious. Tessa, I'm sorry. For everything. For dragging you into my world. For putting you in danger. For not being honest about who and what I really am from the beginning. I sank into the chair beside his bed, exhausted by fear and relief, and the emotional whiplash of the past few days. Who did this? Was it Volkov? We don't know yet. Could be someone else. I've spent years making enemies, Tessa. This was always a possibility. He squeezed my hand weakly. But I understand if this is too much. If you want to walk away, I'll arrange protection for you until we're sure you're not a target, and then I'll let you go. No obligations. No strings. You didn't sign up for this." I looked at him. Really looked, seeing past the wealth and power to the man beneath. Flawed, damaged, carrying scars both visible and hidden, but fundamentally good despite his mistakes. He'd given me a chance when I had nothing, believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, built something beautiful because I'd smiled at him in a dying cafe. "I'm not going anywhere," I said firmly. "Yes, you should have been honest about your past. Yes, this is terrifying and complicated and not what I expected. But Thomas, you saved me first, gave me hope and purpose when I had neither. Now it's my turn to be here for you." His eyes glistened with emotion. "You don't understand what you're committing to." "Then explain it to me. Tell me everything, the whole truth this time. Let me decide if I can handle it with full information." Over the next several hours, as morphine gradually loosened his carefully maintained guards, Thomas told me everything. The poverty of his childhood, the desperation that led him to make deals with dangerous people, the slow climb out of that world into something legitimate, and the ongoing cost of choices made years ago. He'd hurt people, he admitted. Not directly, but through business deals that displaced communities, through loans that carried predatory interest rates, through the kind of ruthless pragmatism that characterized men who valued success above morality. "I've tried to make amends," he said quietly. "The second cup, projects like it in other cities, ensuring displaced communities have affordable housing options in my developments. But you can't undo the past, Tessa. You can only try to build a better future." "I know," I said softly. "And I see what you're building. It's not perfect, but it's good. You're good, Thomas, even if you don't always believe it." He pulled me closer with his uninjured arm, and I carefully positioned myself beside him on the hospital bed, mindful of his wounds. "I love you," he whispered into my hair. "I've loved you since that smile in the bluebird, and I'll love you even if you walk away after everything I've just told you." "I love you too," I replied, the words feeling both terrifying and right. "And I'm not walking away. We'll figure this out together." The investigation revealed that the shooter had been a lone actor, someone from Thomas's past, nursing a grievance that had nothing to do with Volkov. But the Russian appeared at the hospital 2 days after the shooting, alone and unarmed, to deliver a different kind of message. I was there when Konstantin Volkov entered Thomas's room, and I understood immediately why people feared him. He radiated danger in a way that was almost casual, as if violence was simply a tool he kept readily available. "Blackwood," he said, his accent thick but his English perfect. "Someone tries to kill you, and this is how I learn we are not truly finished with each other. Volkov." Thomas shifted to sit more upright, his face tightening with pain from the movement. "To what do I owe this visit? I hear rumors you think perhaps I sent Shooter. This is insulting." Volkov's smile was cold. "When I decide to kill you, Thomas, you will know it comes from me. There will be no mystery." "Comforting," Thomas said dryly. "But Shooter makes me think perhaps I am too hasty in letting you go so easily from our business together." Volkov's gaze shifted to me, assessing and unmistakably threatening. "You have found something worth living for, I see. This changes calculations." I felt Thomas tense beside me, saw his hand move slightly as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "Leave her out of this, Konstantin. Whatever issue you have is with me." "Everything is about leverage, my friend. You know this." Volkov moved to the window, looking out at the city with apparent disinterest. "But today I come not to threaten. I come to offer information." "What information?" "The man who shoots you, his name is Viktor Sokolov. He works sometimes for Dmitry Kuznetsov, who I believe you also know from old days. Kuznetsov still holds grudge about project in Brighton Beach. Thinks you cheat him out of millions. He is not man who forgives." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Why tell me this?" "Because Kuznetsov is sloppy, brings attention to business that benefits no one. Because you pay your debts and honor agreements, which is rare quality. Because—" Volkov turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "I remember being young man making way in world, and someone gives me chance when they do not have to. You do this for me once, long ago. Now debt is paid." He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "You want to leave this life behind, Blackwood? Truly leave it? Then you must eliminate threats, not just avoid them. Kuznetsov will try again. This is certainty. What you do about certainty, this is choice only you can make." After Volkov left, Thomas and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, I spoke. "What did he mean about eliminating threats?" "He means I have 3 options," Thomas said wearily. "Hide for the rest of my life, waiting for the next attempt. Try to negotiate with Kuznetsov, which won't work because he doesn't want money. He wants revenge. Or—" He trailed off, but I understood what he wasn't saying. "Or you do something permanent," I finished quietly. "Yes. Something I swore I'd never do again. Something that would definitively put me back in that world I've been trying to escape." I thought about the second cup, about the community we'd built, about the man Thomas was trying to become versus the man his past required him to be. What if there was a 4th option? "What option is that?" "You go to the police. Give them everything on Kuznetsov, turn state's evidence, put him away legally." Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Tessa, to do that I'd have to admit to my own involvement in criminal activities. I'd lose everything, the company, my freedom, possibly you." "Not everything." I gripped his hand tightly. "You'd keep your soul, Thomas. And you'd keep me, because I can visit you in prison, but I can't love a man who becomes a murderer to protect himself." The choice I was presenting was impossibly harsh, but it was also honest. I loved Thomas Blackwood, but I couldn't love the man he'd be if he chose violence over justice, convenience over consequences. He was quiet for a long time, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. "You're asking me to sacrifice everything I've built." "I'm asking you to be the man you've been trying to become rather than the man you used to be. The choice is yours, Thomas. But know that I'll stand by you either way, whether you're building the second cups from freedom or writing business plans from a prison cell." It took 3 days of consideration, consultations with lawyers, and anguished internal debate. But in the end, Thomas Blackwood did something that men in his position rarely did. He chose the harder right over the easier wrong. He gave federal prosecutors everything on Kuznetsov and 3 other criminal organizations he'd dealt with over the years. In exchange for his cooperation, he received reduced charges and a sentence of 18 months in a minimum security facility, along with substantial fines that left his fortune decimated but not destroyed. The day Thomas was sentenced, I sat in the courtroom and watched the man I loved accept responsibility for his past actions with a dignity that made me proud, even as my heart broke. When he looked back at me from the defendant's table, his eyes held something I'd never seen before. Peace. 18 months later, I waited outside the federal facility as Thomas Blackwood walked out a free man. He'd lost weight, gained some gray in his hair, and acquired a humility that hadn't been there before. But his smile when he saw me was genuine and bright, transforming his face into something beautiful. "You came," he said, as if there had ever been any doubt. "I promised, didn't I?" I moved into his arms, and he held me tightly, his face buried in my hair. "You did. But I would have understood if you'd moved on, found someone whose past wasn't so complicated." I pulled back to look at him directly. Your past made you who you are, Thomas. And who you are is someone worth waiting for. We drove back to the city in comfortable silence, his hand clasped in mine. The second cup had thrived in his absence, managed by a team I'd built and trained. We'd opened 2 more locations in other cities, each one incorporating the same philosophy: community over pure profit, meaning over maximum efficiency. Patricia had kept Blackwood Enterprises running, restructuring it into something completely legitimate and transparent. Thomas would have a company to return to, smaller than before but built on a foundation that wouldn't crumble under scrutiny. "What do you want to do first?" I asked as we crossed the bridge into downtown. He thought for a moment, then smiled. That rare, genuine smile I'd fallen in love with in a dying cafe what felt like a lifetime ago. "I want to go to the second cup. I want to sit in the corner booth, drink an overpriced coffee, and watch you work. I want to remember what it feels like to be in a place where people gather, not because they have to, but because they want to. Where community happens organically. Where a smile can change everything." So that's what we did. Thomas sat in the corner booth that had become known as Mr. Blackwood's table in his absence, and I brought him coffee in our good china. Around us, the cafe hummed with life, regulars at their favorite tables, new customers discovering what we'd built, the constant ebb and flow of people connecting over something as simple as a shared space. I met his eyes across the room, and he smiled at me with such open affection that I felt my heart swell. We'd been through darkness and come out the other side changed, but not broken. We'd chosen the harder path and found it led somewhere worth going. That accidental smile in the bluebird had set everything in motion. His fall and mine, his redemption, and my transformation. It had led us through fear and uncertainty to this moment of hard-won peace. And as Thomas raised his coffee cup to me in a silent toast, I smiled back, deliberately this time, full of love and hope and the unshakable certainty that some mistakes, some accidental moments were really just destiny wearing a disguise.